Good evening, everyone. Welcome to City Lit's virtual launch for The Kids Are All Left, How Young Voters Will Unite America by David Faris. And pleased to welcome his conversation partner tonight. David Faris is an associate professor of political science at Roosevelt University, where he focuses on American political institutions, Middle East politics, and democracy. He's the author of It's Time to Fight Dirty, How Democrats Can Build a Lasting Majority in American Politics, and he's a contributing of the week. His work has also appeared in the Watch, BuzzFeed, the Huffington Post, Daily Beast, and more. He lives in Chicago with his wife and son. Dave Karpf is an associate professor in the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University. Research on political activism and campaigning in the digital age. His perspective on digital politics is forged in a long personal history of environmental activism, decade in various roles with the Sierra Club. He's the author of 2 books, The Move On Effect and Analytism, and he's also written articles for Wired and The Nation. So please join me, everyone, in welcoming him for this lovely discussion tonight.
All right, well, thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Teresa, to everyone for joining us this evening in the middle of international mayhem. I want to particularly thank City Lit Books for hosting this event. City Lit's my favorite, by far my favorite bookstore in Chicago, and it's full of really cool and good. So even if you don't want to buy my book, please do buy something from them if you can. And I also want to thank all of you again for coming, and of course my friend Dave. You should know that Dave has both a 3-year-old and a 3-month-old at home.
1 month old.
1 month?
1 month, yeah, like almost 2 months.
Wow, I really shouldn't have asked you to do this. So. I owe you a really big favor, and it's an honor to share a virtual stage with you. I think the deal is I'm going to read about a 5-minute beginning of the book, and then Dave is going to say about the book, and then throw a few questions at me, and then we'll open it up to everyone else in the Zoom chat. So. If that's all right with everyone on this call, I'm going to go ahead and start reading for 5 minutes. Is that cool? I don't know. Okay. I guess we're the authors of our own destiny here. So, okay. So this is from the introduction. It's called "The Republican Party is Screwed." Okay. Picture yourself for a moment as the commissioner of Major League Baseball, tasked with guarding the fortunes and traditions of the national pastime. A long, languid, humid summer afternoon, Boulevard Tropical Pale Ale, when one of your newest underling, math major fresh out of MIT, plops down into the seat next to you with some alarming news. Our fan base is quickly dying, he says. He shows you a thick binder full of data that confirms your worst fears, the sort of worries that you'd prefer to set aside while enjoying the Royals-Tigers game unfolding in front of you. This was, by the way, all written before the virus, right? So the idea of sitting at a baseball game, so appealing to me. Most of baseball's kids for the games pay $150 a month for their monthly cable subscriptions to catch tilts on TV, and spend their free time in fantasy leagues full of their college friends, are over 50. Americans under 30, especially in growing demographic, soccer or basketball over baseball. The underling is blunt. In 20 years, we will be ice hockey, he warns, a sport mostly loved by a tiny minority, but mostly ignored by the larger culture. And 20 more will be boxing. Gives you a bullet-pointed list of ways to address this problem, refuses your offer of a beer, young people aren't really drinking much these days after all, and walks away. Instead of doing the sensible thing and following his advice, like ramping up youth league efforts, financing underserved communities, quickening the game's pace, promoting the sport's diverse stars, and perhaps placing major league franchises in Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and other places where baseball remains wildly popular, you make a stunning gamble by doubling down on the sport's core dying demographic of older white men. You instruct teams to hold Caucasian nights, celebrating white culture. You eliminate wildcard playoff games, pitch clocks, and designated hitters to return to tradition. You lobby the government to make it harder for international players to get visas, and you appoint old white dudes with thready pulses and gray faces to every single important position of leadership in the game. You ban Latin American players from wearing jewelry or getting tattoos that represent their countries of origin. You look at the hordes of older white fans driving in from the exurbs and packing stadium after stadium in the wall-to-wall media coverage of your antics and bask in self-satisfaction. You suddenly have 1 million followers on Twitter, most of whom aren't even baseball fans, but rather people who seem to enjoy human suffering. Baseball gets a little dead cat bounce, but the future still looks grim. If betting on a dying core demographic, deliberately alienating young people and delighting in open, unapologetic racism seems like a total genius move to you, you're going to love the strategy of the contemporary Republican Party in the United States. There's really no way to sugarcoat this. The GOP is getting clobbered so badly in the competition for young voters that the party's future looks bleaker than an episode of The Handmaid's Tale. The MIT grad has been sitting next to party leaders for years now, reading exit polls and surveys and results in election after election, warning about the extinction level political event hurtling their way to no avail. The chimerical victory of Donald Trump in the 2016 election and his transformation of the Republican Party from the wink wink super secret electoral home of America's racists to an open, frothing white power organization with fond linkages to every authoritarian right-wing nationalist group on the planet has momentarily rescued the GOP from its demographic destiny. The Trump era has given hope to reactionaries who have long dreamed of reimposing their vision of white dominance on the country, and legitimacy to a long list of far-right crackpots who once operated at the margins of society. And if Trump and the Republicans were polling ahead, or even respectably, with young people, I'd be genuinely worried as I scroll through the property listings in Ontario, but they aren't. Even as the US economy hummed along with its lowest levels of unemployment in 40 years prior to the crisis, and as the stock market reached new heights, the Republican Party remained about as popular as tooth extraction with everyone under the age of 40. They see America as a society dominated by conservatives since their parents were children, and blame baby boomers and Gen Xers for systematically looting the country and burning down the bridges that once led to success and prosperity immediately after crossing them. Once upon a time, you could pursue affordable higher education for next to nothing, support a family, and buy a house with a few years of hard work and savings. Now, you get to take out 50 grand in crippling loans just to get through college, even at many flagship state universities that were once effectively free. And the world that confronts you when you get out is harrowing. The best jobs are in major cities where everything feels upcharged. Real wages in many industries haven't increased in decades, and more of your limited income gets eaten up by healthcare costs and housing, even as your callous elders mock you for the avocado toast and lattes that you can't afford and don't buy anyway. Worse, too many people over the age of 45 seem not to get it. They don't understand why they can't call you hot lips anymore, or make jokes about Polish people, or imitate foreign accents, and they are outraged at the idea of a woman being the lead in the new James Bond movie. And they think older brothers and dads exist to protect the virtue of young women, and they quietly, or not so quietly since the election of Trump, believe that the plight of poor folks and minorities is their own fault because they don't work hard enough, and that young people are snowflakes who were given participation trophies just for showing up, and whose brains were warped in childhood by parents who told them how special they were, and that kids should know what the world is really like, and that most of them are not special at all, and they should not be told fairy tales about equality and justice, and they are tired of having their Thanksgiving soliloquies about Ronald Reagan ruined by the sour attitudes of their kids' punk social justice warrior girlfriend or boyfriend. And they have nothing against Muslims or Africans. They were nice to one of them just last week, but they think it's all gone too far, and that somewhere soon they're going to encounter a transgender Syrian activist in the bathroom, and that is why they voted for Trump. And even though sometimes he should shut up on Twitter and stop whining, everything he's doing is basically fine and overdue, and maybe the kids will understand someday, even if they don't now. It's all for their own good. Well, the reality is that every minute about that draw their final breath and expire, and then they are simultaneously replaced in the eligible voting pool by an 18-year-old with a DSA membership and a Jacobin subscription and an unsustainably high college tuition bill, and in the general population by another baby that will have something like a 67% chance of growing up to be a leftist. The basic dynamic is a Republican Party increasingly dominated by and aligned with a dying white demographic, and a Democratic Party that is not exactly beloved, but is grudgingly supported come election time by overwhelming majorities of young people who haven't yet voted in numbers sufficient enough to make anyone take notice. And it is in the process of transforming our politics in ways long dreamed about by democratic strategists and theorists, whose visions of demographic destiny may be accelerated by the galloping stupidity, insufferable unearned arrogance, and legendary incompetence of the Trump administration. So I will stop there because I'm sure you didn't show up tonight to just listen to me read the book. And I will turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Dave Karpf, and we will go from there.
Thanks. So first, let me note, I really enjoyed reading this book. I think people on this call or listening to it recorded are really going to enjoy reading this book. And the thing that stands out to me is that this book makes me a little less pessimistic. Now, it is July 2020. I have not had a coffee in a coffee house, a beer in a bar, or a meal in a restaurant in, what is that, like 4 months? And neither have any of you, if you're at all responsible. So if you're not a little pessimistic in 2020, then you're kidding yourself entirely. This is a pessimistic year. And this book feels like a bit of an antidote for me when I was reading it. Because this book really lays out the deep, clear case that it's not just like the teenagers and the like young 20-somethings who are left. That was true 20 years ago. And as you point out in the book, they haven't moved, which means the generational cohort of people who look at the Republican Party with this extreme distaste on their face is now getting pretty big and pretty old. And they're not souring and turning conservative Republican with age. I think that case is really well made here. And it builds to an argument that says, look, while 2020 is more dire than you expected it to be, also, where did the murder hornets go? What happened to the murder hornets? If we get past 2020, if we get to 2024, 2028, there are all these reasons for optimism. Now, I want to pose that as a question to you, though, because your first book was exactly the level of pessimistic that I usually am. So your first book, It's Time to Fight Dirty, is about all of the institutional levers that the Republicans have been pulling and will continue to pull in order to maintain their grasp on power, regardless of what voters think. And you lay out all of these arguments, all these proposals for how Democrats need to fight back. So there's sort of like this unquiet rage in that first book at all the ways things are falling apart around us. And you acknowledge that in this book, but there's also an optimism in this book. So my first question for you is, like, how'd you get from that first book pessimism to this optimism brewing within this second book?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. I think that some of the renewed optimism comes from what has happened in the United States over the last 4 years, which has been, from my perspective, pretty dire policy-wise, and in a variety of ways, very scary in terms of some of the people that are being empowered right now. But the results of the 2018 midterms, which showed a country that opposed the Trump administration by roughly 8 or 9 points, the surge in activism, the surge in interest in politics, and the sort of the ongoing way that young people are gravitating away from the Republican Party, really helped make me a little bit more optimistic than I was when I wrote It's Time to Fight Dirty in 2017. And when I started writing the book, I had an intuitive sense that young people were trending Democrat. But the big revelation when you go back and you dig through the data is that people started, under 30 voters started turning left in like 2002. And it's really only the sort of differential turnout rates of that cohort of millennials primarily, and now Zoomers, that has allowed Republicans to win a couple of national elections in the interim. And so I'm still very concerned about Democrats taking power and then not adjusting the political institutions that we have to take into account some of the ways that it doesn't translate majority sentiment into majority rule. And I still I had to take down the pinned tweet about that book on Twitter. It was a very sad moment. But I still believe in that book very much. I still believe that those reforms are necessary. And I think that we have, something like a 54 to 46 majority in this country right now, give or take. And the reality is, if we win this year, even if we take if we take everything, we get a clean sweep. When we head into the 2022 midterms, just the dynamics of American politics means that Democrats will be at a disadvantage, even with a national majority. And so I think it's really important not to take your eye off the ball. in that respect, and those reforms are still super important. But I think that looking at voting trends among people under 45 is really heartening, because I think before I started researching it, I shared everyone's assumption that a lot of people get more conservative as they age. And it's worth noting that a lot of people get more conservative as they age, and a lot of people actually get more liberal as they age. But the numbers just aren't there in terms of like flipping an entire generational cohort from one party to the next. And I think if it was going to happen, you would see it in the data about Generation X, which is a modestly Democratic-leaning cohort that has remained pretty much exactly the same since the day they debuted as voters in 1992. Millennials haven't changed, and Zoomers haven't had the opportunity to change yet. But in the book, I find a lot of evidence to suggest that they're probably not going to change in large enough numbers to make a big difference. So that's a long way of saying that I am really optimistic about the future. Even as like everyone, I share the same sense of trepidation about this year and about the election in November, which is not in the bag by any means. So anyway, okay, I'll turn it back to you, Dave.
So the next thing that stands out for me, and this is in the last chapter of the book, so I want to kind of cue you up to talk about it a bit, but I feel like you have me convinced that demographics, the slow march of years, are deeply on Democrats' side. Others have me convinced that geography is deeply on Republicans' side. That because of the institutional levers of the Senate and giving 2 senators to North Dakota, 2 senators to South Dakota, and 2 senators to California, and none to Washington, D.C., thanks a lot, that creates this structural disadvantage, because even if most of our generation, most of Gen X and millennials and Zoomers are tending more and more to be Democrats, they're also concentrated in these cities, which are then underrepresented. So can you talk to us a bit about why demographics are going to trump geography?
Yeah, sure. I'll start by saying that the geography of the Senate and the way it's becoming more and more unequal is a huge problem for American democracy, whether Democrats are about to usher in a 30-year period of dominance or not. It's still messed up. Even if you're the beneficiary of the Senate's disproportionality, it's still not great. But when we don't have like perfect data going on in the states in 2016 and 2018, but the data that we do have suggests that 18 to 29-year-old voters, even in pretty conservative states, are voting Democratic. So if you look at the Beto O'Rourke race in Texas in 2018, he wins young people by 35 points or so. If you look at even in places like Wisconsin or Michigan, where we've got gubernatorial races, you see young people leaning to the left. It's obviously less true in a very red state like a West Virginia or something. But I think people also forget that there's a number of super small states like Vermont and Delaware, New Hampshire. My family in New Hampshire is on this call. That are left leaning. And there's not a lot of evidence from those states to suggest that that's changing. And so as you see the bigger states in the Sun Belt, like Texas and North Carolina and Florida, where young voters, like the rest of the country, vote heavily Democratic, I actually think that the Democrats' structural disadvantage in the Senate is on the wane, even as the actual sort of small d Democratic problems with the Senate are getting way worse. Like something like 50% of the population will live in 16 states by 2040. And so that is a long-term project, I think, for the next governing majority to try to figure out some creative ways to address inequality in the Senate. Granting statehood to DC, which I fully support, will actually make that problem worse from a proportionality perspective, from an apportionment perspective. Puerto Rico will make it maybe slightly better, but the problems with the Senate are like built into our democracy. What makes me optimistic is that I don't think that Democrats have, as long as these trends continue, I don't think that Democrats are staring at a disadvantage in the Senate in the long term.
So now I want to ask you the impossible question, which is, what have you figured out so far about what the coronavirus and our response to it and the after effects of it? What does that do both to our democracy and to your thesis? Like, how do you see that interacting with all the trends you're talking about here?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the coronavirus had struck us as I was going through the very last round of edits on this book. And so I frantically inserted, COVID-19 in like 10 pages in the book, just so people were sure that I was like paying attention, and that I understood what was happening. And it did complicate a couple of things I was saying, like, that the economy is great and young people still hate Republicans because the economy is no longer great, right? And there was sort of like a deluge of commentary at the beginning of the pandemic, where big thinkers published these long articles that were like, the COVID-19 pandemic will make everything that I happen to believe come magically true, because we're all going to see the faults of our society and fix them immediately. So the pandemic actually is the kind of like sort of black swan event that is one of the few things that can actually change your partisanship once you're a fully grown adult. I have a chapter in the book that talks about why people don't change mostly. And there's a lot of research stemming from a variety of different streams to suggest that once you're about 25 or so, you're pretty unlikely to change your partisanship and your ideas about politics. Obviously, if even 5% of the people do so, you're talking about people who change, right? So your personal experience may include people whose politics. But this is it's like you get divorced. You move to surrounded by very different a social network that can influence thinking about things. If you lived your whole life in Brooklyn and you were like a DSA leftist, and then you suddenly move to like the middle of nowhere, Montana, there's a pretty good chance that the people you surround you could alter your views a little bit, right? And so the pandemic actually has had a really stunning and sudden and dramatic impact on older voters, which in the book I say is not possible. So that's a little bit of a challenge for me to explain, but I do think that you can kind of bracket the events of the last 5 months as something that's like so out of the ordinary that we can kind of attribute it to that. And I also, if I was a betting man, I would not bet that even if voters over 65 go for Biden in November, I'm very skeptical that they'll vote for Democrats in the next election, right? But I think that the pandemic has laid bare a lot of the structural problems with our economy and our society that are radicalizing young people. You have a lot of the wealth in the country tied up in older generations, and millennials and Zoomers are not sharing in that wealth in the same way that boomers and members of the silent generation were when they were at this point in their lifespan. You have a pandemic where a lot of people are isolating themselves and going through a lot of hardship on behalf of older people, and not just older people. Like, I don't want to play into the myth that this only affects old people, right? But certainly, I think a lot of the precautions that people are taking are to protect their parents and their grandparents. My parents are on this call. I love you guys. I think that young people feel it's like, here's another instance where they're being asked to make this massive sacrifice. And what are they going to get out of it, right? Like, is college tuition going to go down, right? Like, is the price of housing going to go down? Like, when this is over, is there going to be some kind of reckoning where young folks are sort of invited into the national prosperity in the same way that our elders are? And I don't think that's happening. I think that if you just look at public opinion polling about the president's handling of this crisis, it's very bad. Probably at this point 2-to-1 disapproval of what the president is doing. And I think that I could be wrong about this, right? But the data that I do see suggests that Zoomers and millennials are now tilting even further to the left than they were a couple of months ago. Biden is likely to win both of those groups by 20 or 30 points. And so I just, as much as we're all suffering and in misery right now, I don't really see anything to suggest that the pandemic itself is going to change the thesis of the book, right? What it does do is it forces me to answer a difficult question about how, I don't know, 10 million people over the age of 65 seem to be willing to change their votes between 2016 and 2020. I can do my best to answer that, but I do think that the thesis holds up overall, given the events of the past 4 months.
So I want to air one set of misgivings, because I'm a superstitious guy, and if I don't say them, they come true. I largely align with all that on the effects of the virus immediately. What worries me a little is this is so reminiscent to me of the economic collapse of what was that, like September and October, all of a sudden, 2008, like all of a sudden the economy just like flipped. And there was kind of like a gallows humor joke after that of like, Obama got elected. It's like, cool, clean that up. And that coupled with Mitch McConnell just saying, if I don't help out, you'll get blamed for it. That's my rational calculus. I'll even say that on the record. Who's going to pay attention? Like Mitch McConnell just decided to obstruct. And then in the next midterm, not only did the Democrats lose a ton, but some of their losing was people deciding, okay, I'm going to vote for a Republican then because Democrats are in charge and it's not working. And some of it was people saying, okay, to use the sports analogy, if Republicans are baseball, Democrats obviously are basketball. But the third option is like, forget it, I'm not going to watch sports. Like, I'm just going to give up. I'm going to completely drop out of politics, of voting and civic engagement, because it's just none of it works. And that's the thing that worries me a little is the coronavirus is, particularly because of government mismanagement, now so much worse than the economic collapse of 2008. And turning it around is like, it's not going to happen in a month or a year. We need a vaccine, we need everyone to take the vaccine, and then we need to repair all of the wreckage. So I worry a little that once you have, well, knock on wood, once you have Biden as president and a return to normalcy where people no longer feel like every single night they need to pay attention to what the president tweeted, God, will that be nice? That's also then going to lead to people generically saying, well, I'm not going to vote for the Republicans because that's the party of Trump, and look how that went. Nothing works. I'm just going to tune out. Like I'm not going to do anything. And again, I say that as almost an endorsement, not almost, as an endorsement of your book, because your book is the thing that got my hair a little less on fire with this. That reminded me, if you're only ever thinking short-term, Dave, then you're always going to be worried. But not in the long term, but in the medium term, all the trends look good. But then I still find myself thinking, okay, the trends look good in the medium term. And the coronavirus is, the government response to coronavirus is not leading people to say like, boy, those Republicans, they really have, they really have baby boomers' backs. We should really keep on rewarding them. So in the short term, I think all those trends are really valuable. And medium term, those demographics are going to keep on moving. But man, it would be nice if, assuming November goes well for the Democrats, if they weren't coming in with this much repair work to do and a public that's wondering 6 months later, why haven't you fixed it all already? And the answer is because it's probably going to take a decade to fix that wreckage. That said, I see we have questions coming in, so we should probably open it up to questions instead of me talking about why I'm scared of the coronavirus all the time.
We do have a question from Craig. What's Faris's sense of whether we're headed towards a new party system? Third parties are always doomed, but young people are increasingly challenging or replacing older, more conservative Democrats. Does he think it more likely that the Democrats get hauled all the way over, or that we see a dying Republican Party and new DSA flavored parties?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something I address a little bit in the last chapter of the book, the conclusion, where I talk about how the biggest threat probably to a long period of Democratic dominance is a splintering of the party system, because I'm a big proponent of multi-party democracy, and I would love to have one here. But my concern is that we don't have an electoral system that's set up to reward third and fourth and fifth parties with actual seats in our legislatures rather than being spoilers. And there's a lot of ways to address that, including ranked choice voting, which I think is really catching on these days. But I will say that the generational split that you see in our politics between the parties is also there in the party. So if you look at the exit polls from the primaries and caucuses that were conducted prior to the coronavirus nightmare, you see Joe Biden, decisively winning the vote of Democrats over the age of 45, and you see Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren splitting the votes of voters under the age of 45, although definitely more of them went to Sanders than to Warren. And that showed up in primary after primary after primary, especially on Super Tuesday, where you see young people, according to these metrics, I'm a young person, I'm 42, and I'm a younger Gen Xer, and you do see in the data that younger Xers are much more sort of Democratic leaning than their older counterparts. But there's a real split in the Democratic Party right now, and the reason, one of the reasons that Biden was able to win is that older Democrats sided with him so decisively that it kind of kept the nomination out of his hands. And I think you're seeing these disagreements come up in places like the Eliot Engel primary in New York a couple of weeks ago, where a long-term sort of more conservative Democrat was defeated in a primary by a younger challenger, a person of color. And I think that those trends are only going to accelerate. And I think that it's just inevitable over the next 10 or 15 years that the voters that preferred Bernie in this primary, the voters that preferred Elizabeth Warren in this primary are going to become the predominant force within the party, especially in the primaries. And that's just that's something you just set and forget, right? There's nothing really anybody can do about that. And in the years to come, I think you'll see a Democratic Party that is moving, a bit, maybe not dramatically year by year, but over time will move pretty dramatically to the left, unless current ideological trends change and incoming 18 to 21-year-olds are more conservative, and we just don't see any evidence that that's the case. Even with people under the age of 18, we have some polling data for them. And they seem to be just as far to the left as millennials and their older counterparts in the Generation Z. So anyway, the answer to that is really dependent on some of the things that unfold in the next 4 years. I think if Biden is elected and he governs in a super cautious manner and doesn't eliminate the filibuster and doesn't pursue real healthcare reform and is just content with nibbling along the margins of our politics, I think you're going to see a lot of defections from young voters to third-party candidates in 2022 and 2024. I don't see, I worry about this in the book. I don't see a ton of evidence that young people are ready to walk out of the Democratic Party and join the Greens or something, because there really isn't a coherent alternative to the Democratic Party at the national level or really at any state level that would compete with Democrats at this moment, but that could change. And I think the biggest threat to a Democratic majority is splitting the Democratic Party without reforming the electoral system, right? If we had ranked choice voting, where you could vote for whoever you want without spoiling, without being a spoiler, I think you'd immediately see a splintering of the Democratic Party, and that might not even be that bad of a thing, right? But the really important thing we have to keep in mind is you can't put the cart before the horse. You have to reform the electoral system first before you want large numbers of people migrating to some third party, the DSA or whatever it is, right? And so, what I see from this question is a dying Republican Party and a Democratic Party that mostly has the loyalty of young voters, but that, in midterm and state elections, sometimes, depending on the performance of the national party, young people may desert the party at very unfortunate and ill-timed moments, and that's how Republicans could still win elections in the next 10 or 15 years. And it's diminished turnout, and it's splintering the Democratic.
Another question from Madeline: how does voter suppression affect these trends?
Another great question. So, voter suppression, it varies by state. You take a state like Texas, and there are something like 800,000 people in Texas, mostly people of color who lack the state's requirements to vote, the identification or whatever it is. And there's all sorts of other tactics like closing down polling places, and generally just eliminating early voting, things like this. Right? These things are pursued pretty unapologetically in Republican-dominated states, and they do have a real effect. I'll just give you one example. There's a study that came out very recently that that voter suppression tactics in Florida probably cost Democrat Bill Nelson his seat, and not just like the sort of open voter suppression, right? Like the fact that millions of Floridians are deprived of their right to vote because of felony disenfranchisement laws, means that Democrats probably would have won the governorship, the Senate race, and the presidential election in Florida in 2016. What happened? And it has a real effect on the margins. So, you can price in a state like Florida or a state like Wisconsin, where you have a Republican trifecta, that is, the Republicans control the legislature and they control the governorship, that suppression could take 1 or 2, maybe 3% at the outset of the vote away from Democrats, and that's a real concern. But when you look at the sheer magnitude with young people, again, I'm a young person, so everybody under the age of 45. When you look at the sheer magnitude of that advantage, you count of a 35-point deficit, and so it's a concern this year. If Biden's lead goes from 10 points or so that it is now to like 4 points, I will be right with you in a mortal panic about how voter suppression might cost Democrats the election. At 10 points, I'm not concerned at all. And I think moving forward in the future, there's a lot of states that are controlled by Republicans right now, like Texas, that they are seeing such a deficit with young people that they will lose control of the state at some point in the next 10 years. And when they lose control of the state, they will lose control of the voter suppression apparatus. I'm pretty optimistic about that overall. Absent some like real democratic break of the kind that we typically only see in other countries, I'm confident that these voter trends, in most, not all, but most states, will allow the party to reverse some of these voter suppression efforts. I will also say there's a lot that can be done at the national level. So again, I don't have any wood near me, but knock on wood, Biden wins. Democrats take the Senate, and all they have to do is just pass HR 1, right, which is a sweeping sort of voting rights and electoral integrity reform. There's all kinds of things that the party can do nationally to stop the states from doing, because there's a clause in the U.S. Constitution that says that that Congress has a pretty sweeping power over federal elections. So you could say you can't tell us, like, they're illegal, and then Idaho is going to do voter ID for state elections, but not for federal elections. It would very quickly become clear that that's not workable. And so a lot of the worries about voter suppression really are up to the next Democratic majority in DC to deal with. And if they deal with it and they want to deal with it decisively, they're going to have to kill the filibuster first. But if that will dramatically decrease the ability of the Republican Party to do some of these things.
From Sarah, this question: how is the experience of going through the pandemic causing Americans, on average, to reevaluate the equity of themselves and others in the United States? Any thoughts on how this may affect politics here in unpredictable ways?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I don't know that we have polling data to be able to say confidently what the effects of those perceptions of equality and sort of what they want the government to do, because you could make the case both ways, right? Like on one hand, I'm in a city, and the pandemic has laid bare, I think, to a lot of people, a lot of liberals who vote Democratic has laid bare to them the way that things are like a little bit more broken than they thought that they were. So, for instance, I've been getting all of my groceries delivered from Instacart for the last 4 months. And the folks that are delivering my groceries are mostly young people of color, and they're not being paid very well, and they may be working under duress. And I have the privilege of being able to stay home with my wife and my son and just sort of hide out from the world. And I think a lot of young people in particular don't have that luxury. And they're being forced into sort of jobs and modes of work that are unjust. And so I'm hopeful that will only sort of like accelerate a kind of a reckoning in our society where we really kind of sit down and say, like, we can't do things like this anymore. On the other hand, it's not unusual for crises and economic declines and sort of when we're fighting over resources, for that to bring out the sort of the innate selfishness of people. And so if things get really dark and really bad, and none of us know where they are headed, it could also be the case that people's patience with reforming the system and making things more equal will have been exhausted just at the moment when we have the ability to do something about it. And so I can't here, and I'm like super duper confident that a super majority of Americans have decided that we have much too unequal a society and we have to fix it. I think that's still up to the next governing majority in DC to bring people along with them and to make the kind of reforms that they need to make to not just kick power back to the Republicans in 2022.
From Kate, how could growing acceptance of climate change by both parties change the Republican Party?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked this question. So, there's a big partisan split in perceptions of climate change, right? Not telling you anything you don't know. And most Democrats believe that it's a problem that needs to be addressed in increasingly radical ways. I think many Republicans believe not necessarily that it's like a hoax or that it's not there, but maybe that it's not necessarily caused by us, or that we can live in a warmer world, or like there's more or less intelligent cases that can be made. And one of the things that's really striking when you look at the polling data for younger Americans is that younger Republicans and younger conservatives tend to be much closer to the Democratic Party consensus about climate change than the Republican Party consensus about climate change. And so that seems to me like a big potential wedge issue for young Republican voters who much more so than their older counterparts believe that climate change is a man-made problem that needs man-made solutions in the form of mitigation efforts. And so climate change, I say this in the book, climate change is like a big, I think, big risk for the Republican Party. Republicans really cannot afford to lose any more younger voters than they ever want to win a national election again. And climate change is a place where the national party is out of step, even with young Republicans, right? And the Republicans who may believe in lower taxes and less government intervention in the economy, nevertheless do believe that climate change is real, and they want something done about it. And so I think it's a real opportunity for Democrats to pick off those voters. It's also obviously an opportunity for the Republican Party to change its stance on these and to appeal to the younger voters in their coalition. And maybe even, if climate change is your number one issue and you're voting Democratic because of climate change, right? Like you agree with Republicans about other stuff. It's an opportunity to win those voters back. And so it's I'm not a Republican strategist, and I don't want to tell them how to win because I don't want them to win. But if I was, I would say, you need to get the national party in a room together and be like, you guys got to take this stuff seriously. Like you don't have to do the Green New Deal or whatever, but like you got to do something that's different than what you're doing right now.
From Mayor, how do you think the Republicans will respond to the future you described? Their strategy now seems to be National Front plus voter suppression plus other forms of election manipulation via disinformation and those sorts of things. Do you think they'll drive that bus straight off a cliff, or they adapt?
Great question. In long term, if the trends that I see in this data hold true, I do think that you will see a long-term sort of moderation of the Republican Party, in the same way that you saw the Democratic Party move to the right from the 70s to the 90s in response to multiple shellackings in a row at the hands of Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. It sort of it can convince a lot of Democrats to change their tune about certain things if they ever wanted to win again. And I think that general dynamic will come into play eventually. In the short term, I don't think that's what's going to happen. Like, if you look at the path to victory for Democrats, if Democrats take back the Senate, the process of taking back the Senate means eliminating like the 5 remaining Republican moderates in the Senate, right? And so without Collins and without Gardner and who am I forgetting here? Who's the other goner? Without McSally, without these much more moderate Republicans in the caucus, what you're left with is a 46, 47, 48 senator caucus in the Republican Party that's actually much more sharply conservative than it was before. And you will still have, please God, former President Trump out there sort of like shaping the party's direction and rhetoric. And I think a series of younger Republicans like Tom Cotton, who have sort of imbibed the Trumpism and are like better at it than Trump is, or are more competent stewards of government. And so I think, in the short run, I actually think that the Republican Party will be more radicalized and more conservative between 2020 and 2024. And so it's only in the long term that I think you will see Republicans maybe adjusting to new realities. And I think that actually really depends on the ability of Democrats to win 2, 3, 4, 5 elections in a row before Republicans will recognize that they have such a policy problem on their hands that they have to moderate.
Yeah, I would just add, put me on team. They're driving the bus off the cliff here. That just seems because for them to get through 3, 4, 5 shellackings, that's the window of opportunity for also dealing with things like climate change. That so much has to get dealt with in the midst of that like the long run, whatever it is going to look unlike the world that we know today. Like a world in which Republicans actually got out of the way of doing something meaningful, like something Green New Deal scale, which is what we're now going to need, because we needed to start moving on this stuff 20 years ago. Now we need something radical just to be at all reason scientists are telling us we need. The world in which they actually came along with that is a world so divorced from the Republican Party today that, yeah, everybody who's currently in power in the Republican Party is first going to go face first off the cliff, including all of the judges who will try to overturn anything that gets done on some made-up reason. So yeah, at least for the next decade, we're talking about driving straight off of the cliff before they're anywhere close to moderation.
Agreed.
So those are all the questions. I don't know if anyone else has any other questions you want to put in the chat. Be a good time to do that. Okay, so from Andrew, thought it was so on point when you predict in the book that if Trump and the Republicans get wiped out in 2020, the immediate response from the right could be they weren't conservative enough.
Yeah, great question, Andrew. And whenever you lose an election, there's an effort inside the party and by party elites to figure out why you lost. After I remember I taught a class the day after the 2016 presidential election. It was a class called "Electing the President 2016," and I had a group a group of like very dispirited young people in the class with me. I was also dispirited, so it's that they weren't alone. And we talked for like 90 minutes. So like, what the hell happened, right? Like, how did this happen? And the reality is, you can do your best to diagnose what went wrong, but the party is generally going to be split between people who are like, we didn't do enough to appeal to folks on the other side. Hillary shouldn't have said the thing about deplorables. It was Comey, and it was we abandoned the rural voters. And there's going to be another group, right? That's like, Hillary would have won if she had run further to the left. And there's not really a right answer because the exit polls only tell us so much about the electorate, and it's really hard to divine like hard and fast lessons from one data point, right? And one data point is like, you lost this election, how do we fix the next one? And I think there's a real tendency, particularly among political elites in both parties, to like fight the last war and be like, whatever it was that went wrong in 2016, we got to do the opposite thing this year. And I think, interestingly, that's not happened with Democrats this year, where they went, the primary voters at least went with a candidate who was like pretty similar to Hillary Clinton in a lot of different ways, but who seems to be winning by close to double digits at this, if the election were held today, which of course it will not be. There's a risk that you pick the wrong direction. You're like, this is what I thought went wrong, and then you double down on what went wrong. And so I do think it will be a little bit harder for those postmortems to argue that Republicans weren't conservative enough in this election. I don't even want to use the word conservative, right? Like, I'll just say hardline, right? Like, and President Trump is leaning into that sort of hardline motif about policing and law and order and Antifa, the boogeyman, and so it's going to be. I'm not saying it can't happen, but it's going to be harder for people to argue that Trump should have been like more bloodthirsty in responding to the protests, or like, I don't know how much more hardline President Trump could appear right now than he is. Like, he's not making any effort really to appeal to Democrats. And so that doesn't mean that it won't happen. But I think that the broader argument will be a little bit harder for those forces to win, to say like, we should have been more anti-immigration. It's like, you can't be any more anti-immigration than you are right now, right? And the president has essentially sealed the borders of this country. And he's like magically succeeded, and for the first time in like 40 years of polling data, in convincing a plurality of Americans that we should have more immigration rather than less, right? And so it's like, people will make the case, right? Like, you've read The Federalist, right? Like, it's like completely divorced from reality. So they will make the case. I just don't know that it's going to be convincing to that many people.
So we have another question from Ralph. I wonder if my son could speak a bit about the movement of voters from both parties to the independents.
Sure. That's a great question, Dad. And I know that you are an independent voter, registered independent. And the trend over the last 30, 40 years has been for increasing numbers of people to not be registered with either Democrats or Republicans, but to self-identify as an independent. And there's interesting little wrinkles in that data. So the number of people that identify as independent tends to decrease as a major national election approaches. So in like the early 2019, you'll have 40% of the electorate say I'm an independent, and then like November, I guarantee you, November 2020, that number is going to go down, and people will gravitate back towards the party that they lean toward. I think in the longer term, the growth of self-identified independents speaks to the failure of both parties to earn the loyalty of large numbers of voters who, even if they turn out to vote for you on election day, like, you come out and you vote for Joe Biden in November, and somebody on the way out of your polling place is like, what are you? And you're like, I'm an independent. That's a little bit of a failure of the Democrats to build loyalty with you, right? And I think it's a long-term I don't know if it's a problem, but it's a long-term feature of our party system that, you know, probably a plurality of the public at this point self-identifies it as independent, but leans one way or the other consistently between elections. And you'll see, you know, independents will, more so than any other voting bloc in the United States, change between elections. You know, so you know, Hillary Clinton lost independent voters decisively, and now President Trump is, you know, again, if the election were held today, lose them decisively. So there's you know, there's a caricature of an argument out there right now that there's no such thing as a voter. That is all you have to do to win an election is to appeal to your own base, right? Ignore everyone else, and don't even try to persuade the people in the middle. And I don't think that that's a winning strategy. The big shift that you see in independence between 2016 and 2020 is evidence that, you know, you still can change people's minds. But, you know, interestingly, most, not all independents, not the independents on this call, tend to be people who don't pay that much attention to politics, and sort of tune in like this, you know, in September of the election, make their decisions based on the conditions that they see around them, and they will often break for the sort of the challenger to the status quo that they're disaffected with. You know, I think in the long run, if you know, if either party wants to win the affection of independents, you know, moving forward, they have to do something to change public perceptions of Congress and public perceptions of the presidency, and the sort of like sort of ongoing and seemingly deep dissatisfaction with the trajectory of American politics and the trajectory of American society. Like, pollsters have been asking people, is America on the right track or the wrong track for a very long time? And it's even in good times, it's been on the wrong track for forever. You know, so it's like, how do we convince, you know, how does one party convince a majority of people to say, like, things are okay in this country right now? And you're not gonna be able to do that this year, obviously, because everyone's miserable. But that's a challenge, I think, for both of the parties moving forward.
So it doesn't seem like there are more questions. Dave, do you have more questions?
No, and I think that's around a good spot to end on. That, again, to reiterate, this is a book that to me is about looking beyond 2020 and what's going to happen in 2020 to the medium-term dynamics. And it's a breath of fresh air. It's reason for some optimism as we move through this endless year that seems to be eating everything. That if we get past this, things start to get better.
I will keep that in mind as I care for my toddler for the 120th straight day without any daycare. So we all need a little dose of optimism. So I'll just say thanks so much. I'm really so honored to everyone that joined this call, and to CityLit for hosting us, and to my dear friend Dave for taking time out of his caring for a 1-month-old, I want to add, to be with us for this event tonight. Thank you so much, and it really means a lot to me.
Thank you so much. I think we all feel optimistic, so I really appreciate that. Thanks to both of you. It was a great conversation.
Thank you, Teresa, and thanks to CityLit. And everyone, please be back from CityLit. If you're in Chicago, go to CityLit. Muted clapping. All right, thanks everyone. It's great to see so many familiar faces here, and you know, we'll see what happens in November. Good night.